This is Gallery 19,
Okay.
which is part of our display, Conversations with the Collection. And this room's called Creative Terrains, and it's really looking at lots of different examples of where artists have responded to the landscape, the environment, or their surroundings. So if we take a seat in front of the Richard Lang. From your perspective as an artist and a writer, do you remember when you first saw this work?
It's one of these pieces that you'll see time and time again. What was interesting for me was trying to think whether I'd actually ever seen the work in the gallery space rather than in a book. And I'm not sure that I ever have.
What do you see when you look at this photograph?
I think one of the reasons I've always responded to it is it's incredibly modest. It's a line made by walking, literally. It's a flat field with some bushes at the end, and you can't quite see what it is or where it is. So there's a real kind of anonymity to it. There's nothing particularly special about the place. There's not kind of information. It says England 1967, but you don't really get that. You don't really get any more information. I think when you're learning to be an artist and learning to make work and trying to figure out what it is you're interested in, actually seeing somebody that goes out into the countryside, out into nature, and can find ways to make work there and not just be in your studio. I think that was probably really quite informative for me. And when you look at it, it is just you would probably regard the work as being the act of walking itself, and maybe the photograph as a documentation of an action. And it's interesting that obviously it's a photograph, so it's very static. It's singular, and I suppose, you've got this lovely line kind of going down the middle of it. But there's something about how we can look at it and remember, and I'm sure he still remembers the movement and the action of him walking.
Like you say, this is a snapshot, a moment of after the work is made, after Richard Lang completed the walk. Yeah. So we don't know how long it took him to do this, to make that mark on the grass in this, as you say, anonymous field. We know he took a train from Waterloo and we got off about 20 minutes later, but he doesn't tell us where this is. And so there's something quite anonymous about that.
I'm curious to know more about this now, because I think as I do my walk drawings, it's not just about the lines I walk and where I walk, it's about the birds, it's about the flowers, it's about everything else that's kind of part of that that movement through. So I'm when I look at this now and I can think, oh, it looks like there's lots of little white dots there. I'm kind of wondering what kind of flowers they are. The trees look like they're in full bloom, so you kind of think, well, maybe it's in the summer. I wonder if these flowers are little daisies, or I wonder if they're speedwells or something like that. I wonder what other flowers are there, I wonder what kind of trees there are. I wonder what the bird song was. I wonder if in all the walks he does, he's actually interested in all these other things that are going on, because it's not just about the movement. It's about, for me, it would be about what else you might hear, or what else you might see, or whether there were midges out, or whether there were, there's all these other things that are going on in that space.
It never occurred to me to ask, are those daisies, or what type of trees they are. And this is where I think your perspective as an artist invested in kind of the overlooked elements of nature is so interesting.
I think before I was an artist or a writer, I was a hill walker and I was a bird watcher. So that informs kind of where I go and what I do. And I think as I've got older, I've paid more attention to the flowers that I see, moths, butterflies, so I'm always kind of aware of all these other things as I go out and walk. In order to care for something, you have to notice it. So what are the ways that we can bring things to people's attention to start to notice? You know, it can be, and I think it can be as simple as like the act of walking. You know, like how important is the act of walking? I think that we can easily take the ability to walk and to go places and to access places. We can take it for granted.
That's so true. It could have been a private field and he didn't have permission from the landowner, and so it's transgressive on many levels, not just on a visual or artistic level, but almost his own right to be there. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's just a regular field, but I quite like the idea that, you know, you could just kind of creep in and subvert something, and there's a whole different level of stuff going on that we wouldn't necessarily realise.
And you, in asking us to pay attention, and I feel that is perhaps an invitation that Richard Long is making as well, you made the point that this artwork was made 56 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you feel that, from our perspective of viewing it over half a century later, do you feel that things have changed in how we might understand this as essentially a record of human intervention on a landscape? Do you think what we might bring to it as a contemporary audience is different from how people first viewed it in the late 60s?
I think definitely on lots of different levels. I think we would look at it now with that awareness of nature and what we're doing to it. Like where, you know, how we would view it in terms of like the climate emergency. You know, whether we would go back to that area now and it might be completely barren because there's been no rain, or we could go back to it now and actually it's not there because houses have been built on it. You know, so there's all these kind of questions about how we now view land and nature now compared to 50 years ago. I think there's probably also questions about, if we think about it from a gendered perspective, the solitary man being able to go and walk in nature, these questions of whether we feel allowed to or able to go out on our own, how we feel as women walking on our own, do you know, how we feel as if you're black or a person of colour, access, you know, like there's all these different questions that I think kind of start to layer into these questions of the possibility of going out. It's really nice to sit or stand in front of a work and just to think about just the different levels at which you might encounter it, and also not expect necessarily the works to give you answers, but to ask questions and to see where these questions might take you or lead you without feeling a pressure. Sometimes I think just giving yourself space and time in front of a work and just seeing what comes into your head can be a really good thing to do, because you're not necessarily going to get everything immediately. You know what, I think sometimes the frame of mind you're in can make a huge difference. The time of day that you experience something, you know, like there'll be some times you'll, I think, go into a gallery and see something and not get it, and then you'll maybe go back later and something about it will speak to you.
Amanda, in your walk drawings, you've made a particular body of work that relate to Abernethy, but that are a form of drawing as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how those were made? And you use GPS, is that right?
Yeah, I used the handheld GPS so that I would be able to re-find the dead trees, because I was really interested in how dead trees support the ecology of a forest, and I wanted to map where they were in a particular point. So I used the GPS each time I went out so that I'd be able to find the trees again, because even though it was in quite a small space, I wouldn't necessarily be able to find them. So I became really interested in how I could start to track the routes that I'd made through using a GPS, and it's been something I've continued, and particularly during lockdown, but prior to lockdown I would take my GPS from my house, and when I walked I would take the GPS, so I've got all these tracks where I walk, and they're thicker where I walk more, and they're thinner, where I occasionally go off piece to look for a bird. I didn't want them to be too literal. I liked that idea of how they allude to map and map making. I also like the idea that you wouldn't necessarily be able to go to where I've made them and do the routes I've made. I don't particularly want people following the trees. I think the maps for the dead trees are really interesting though, because I think I started making that work about in 2004-05 perhaps. So even if you were to look at the maps now and go back, the trees won't be there because they'll have fallen, or they'll have died, or they've decayed. So I like the idea that even though you potentially have a map, it's a map of change, and it will be different every time you go back.
And takes us back to time as well.
Yeah.
That your walk drawings they're actually a snapshot of a moment in time,
Yeah.
even though they look like they're about extended duration and many hours of walking.
Yeah.
They're also somewhat like a line made by walking
Yeah.
a very tiny fraction of time in relation to the whole.
Yeah, and nobody quite knows how long it's taken.
Well, Amanda, I want to thank you so much for joining me here in Edinburgh to talk about a work made in England in 1967. Yeah. And thank you so much for your amazing insights about both Richard Long's work and your own art practice.
Thank you, yeah. It's actually, it's really lovely spending this amount of time in front of one work. We never do that, do we?
I know,
so, well,
it's
you
a
probably
privilege.
do, but I don't, yeah.
We have to spend more time and be less hurried and
Absolutely.
take our time over each artwork. It's a good reminder.
Good thing to take home, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.